the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning, and welcome to this week's episode of A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and in this episode we will raise the question: if escalation of the Russian war against Ukraine will occur, should NATO and the European Union nations intervene to protect Ukraine? Who or what can assist in bringing this war to a close? For many of us around the world, for example, Russia's war against Ukraine raises a philosophical dilemma. Is the defense of the vulnerable the correct pathway toward re-establishing peace? And specifically defense. What should defense look like? Do we as members of the international community stand by and allow innocent people to be murdered in the name of geopolitical doctrine or ambition? Or do we truly have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable? In last week's episode, we explored how Russia had advanced ahead of NATO and Europe in matters of deterrence. We also canvassed the responsibility to protect principles. Today, we deep dive into how concerned nations may be able to come to Ukraine's aid, and under what circumstances could this be possible, and how will such resolutions be defined. But before we deep dive into these issues, do remember, if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, feel free to comment, as we can include your interaction in this program. So let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who's waiting online to discuss these issues. Good afternoon, Paul. Tēnā koe.
Yeah, tēnā koe, Selwyn.
You know, what we've got ahead of us here is something that has kind of been on the outskirts since our program last week, but it hasn't really been pulled all together by many organisations at all, Paul. So it's going to be a challenge, but also one that is vitally important, I believe, in this. And the main questions are, as I outlined in the introduction, how concerned nations may be able to come to Ukraine's aid, under what circumstances could effective assistance be possible, and how will such resolutions be defined, advanced, and enforced. So Paul, can you take us through what is, in the first instance, what is available to the, members of the international community, nations that want peace to be restored, however that is defined?
Okay, let me continue from where we left off last week, because it'll lead into an answer to your question. So the Russians were able initially to deter NATO from getting involved. There was the nuclear threat, the escalation threat, and so NATO, has used the excuse that Ukraine is not a NATO member to basically stay out of the fight, other than to provide logistical support. However, we also talked about tactical deterrence, which is deterrence on the battlefields. It's not macro deterrence, if you will, but it's in the fight itself. And Ukraine is achieving a degree of deterrence because of the amount of supplies, particularly anti-tank munitions and anti-aircraft munitions, that it's receiving from the West. Their constant resupply is outstripping the Russians' ability to replace their destroyed tanks and what have you. So we're achieving, in effect, a strategic stalemate in Ukraine, where the Russians cannot advance at will. They can try to hold on to their positions, but the Ukrainians are already preparing and mounting counteroffensives. For example, northwest of Kyiv, the Ukrainians have surrounded an entire army corps of Russians. They're cut off from other Russian forces. They can flee back over the border into Belarus. But the point here is the Ukrainians, because of that good supply of, the most vital munitions, which again, anti-armor, anti-aircraft, are slowly turning the tables on the Russians in the larger part of the country. Of course, in the southeast, The Russians still have the advantage, but even there, their attempt to establish a land bridge between Mariupol and the Crimea looks increasingly difficult to achieve. If they make a move on Odessa, the Russians do not control the land access to the port city of Odessa. So any assault on the city would have to come from the sea. The Ukrainians are well prepared to defend against amphibious assaults. So this opens a moment of opportunity, right? The Russians can see that they're not advancing, their initial objectives are unachievable. They can continue with their terror campaign, their war of annihilation against civilian populations, but it seems that that only steels the resolve of the Ukrainian military to deal to them. Now, it's at this point where the international community can introduce the responsibility to protect doctrine in order to justify the introduction of international peacekeepers, the so-called blue helmets. And we can talk about the different types of peacekeeping, but the point is, it's those type of stalemates when neither side has a clear advantage that peacekeepers can be very useful because they open space in hostilities for negotiation on an outcome that will allow the aggressor to save face as he exits, and it will allow the victims to maintain the status quo prior to the aggression. So I think we've reached that point. To talk about it in a tangential way, you know, we hear a lot in the world today about supply chain problems. Well, guess what? There is a factory in Iowa in the United States that makes Javelin missiles. These are anti-tank missiles. The demand for those missiles has completely outstripped their productive capability. And all of those missiles are going to the Ukraine. So it gives you an idea of the logistical support that the West is starting to put into the Ukrainian military. And the Russians simply cannot keep up. So I think that this may go on for another week or so, but at some point, the Russians will realize we can no longer press whatever advantage we have. The best we can do is consolidate what we have in southeastern Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, withdraw from around Kiev because they're not going to take that city. That's pretty clear at this point. And literally sue for peace, find an honorable way out. At that point, peacekeepers can be introduced, but I'll leave you with this thought. The Poles have already spoken of a NATO peacekeeping force. The Canadians have spoken of a peacekeeping force, but not necessarily of NATO. And that's the key. I believe that the idea of a NATO peacekeeping force is a no-go. The Russians will not accept that under any circumstance because NATO is their enemy. However, if a peacekeeping force is assembled from non-European countries, from other parties, let's say, you know, it could even be from New Zealand, but from Japan, from Brazil, you know, these are countries that have experience with peacekeeping. They've done it in other parts of the world, and they're not central parties to this fight. That might be a starter. Get non-regional peacekeepers in there who have no axe to grind with the Russians per se, other than the invasion, and then implement whatever form of peacekeeping the UN or regional organizations decide to implement. And there's the final point. The UN can order a peacekeeping mission without the Security Council involvement. That was actually done in 1950 at the start of the Korean War. That was actually mandated by the General Assembly, a majority of vote in the General Assembly. It can also be mandated by regional organizations. I mean, the EU could order a peacekeeping mission. The regional organization that has used peacekeepers the most in recent times is the African Union, which has intervened repeatedly in civil wars, in ethnic wars, but using peacekeepers from the Union. That is a model that I think people would be very wise to look at and perhaps emulate in this particular instance.
Okay, so let's pick up some of the threads of that and we'll go deeper and look into if that's the objective, that's an option that is available, peacekeeping. What are the challenges and what is the body that is best to drive a particular resolution on that point? If we look at, for example, reportage overnight coming out of Russia by way of European media, we had the Foreign Minister Lavrov making it very clear that if NATO or the EU countries or member states or economies made a move relating to peacemakers or peacekeepers inside Ukraine, then Russia would deem that an escalation and would respond in kind. Now, those issues of deterrence are clearly there in the sense that, as we have outlined in previous episodes, namely last week, that the issue relating to deterrence seems to only work when you have leaders that are reasonable. If you look at the actions of Putin at the moment, I think it's very clear that the West is feeling he has the deterrence advantage. So therefore, threats, no matter how they are conditioned, with respect to peacekeeping moves, are probably going to be taken seriously. There's that component. But Paul, also within the United Nations, there's a general feeling among populations, particularly in the West, that the United Nations is toothless. It sits on its hands and does nothing. It tut-tuts at aggression and atrocities that occur around the world, but then very little occurs from it. And I think the damage with respect to what occurred in Rwanda is probably very key to that view taking hold in the first place. But that's not necessarily the case, is it? You've been investigating exactly how the UN can respond immediately and with haste as a body that pulls some sort of means together that could or could not potentially be linked or hinged on talks between the two significant parties. Can you take us through that, please?
First of all, the introduction of peacekeepers is not an escalation. In fact, it's a deliberate de-escalation. So the Russians are bluffing here. And although they have had the strategic advantage in terms of deterring NATO involvement, the threat to escalate because peacekeepers are introduced, I would say, is a very idle threat. And we have to remember, I mean, even if the Russians resorted to tactical nuclear weapons, I mean, dare we even mention the actual use of these weapons? What's coming at them is the nuclear arsenals of the Europeans and the United States, the UK, France, the United States. I think the Chinese will stay out of it, but that's end of days scenario, and I don't think the Russians are that irrational. They simply are trying to prepare the terrain to keep things in their advantage, but that advantage has been lost, and it's been lost on the battlefield. So where do we go from here? Well, again, I don't think a NATO peacekeeping force should even be mentioned because that'll just, stiffen the Russians' resolve. The UN voted, I think it was 141-7, to condemn the Russian invasion. If the General Assembly gets numbers even remotely close to that in favor of peacekeeping missions, then it's a go. It's a green light to put peacekeepers in. Now, if you'll indulge me this tutorial, let me talk about the four main types of peacekeeping, because that I think is going to be the crux of the matter.
And it is actually the framework in which this whole argument rests on.
Exactly. It's going to be one of these four types. So let's start with the lightest touch and then go to the heaviest touch. The lightest touch is what is known as observation peacekeeping. A classic example today is the UN peacekeeping mission in the Sinai, and the separating Egyptians and Israelis, if you will. They are unarmed. They are there just to observe a ceasefire agreement that was made by the parties in question.
And so we're not there yet, are we? We're not there yet with respect to negotiations between the two. I mean, it may be ideal, but the two parties are just not there.
We're very far from that. Okay, that's way down the road, if ever. But let's remember, they are virtually unarmed, and they are not considered combatants under the Geneva Convention and the laws of war. So they're the equivalent of civilians as far as the law is concerned. And that, of course, is because it deters the militaries from attacking them directly. Now, again, the record in all of this is very mixed, but you get the point with observation peacekeeping missions. They're there to basically observe, monitor what has already been agreed upon. Now, there is something known as interpositional peacekeeping. And now we're getting a little closer to the nub. Interpositional peacekeeping, as the name implies, is that the blue helmeted peacekeepers would be a buffer between two belligerent sides, that they would get in the middle of the fight. And because they are lightly armed, see, they would not bring heavy weapons. They would be lightly armed in the sense they would carry personal self-defense weapons. But they get in between the two belligerent parties while those parties hash out some sort of ceasefire.
Okay,
So
on that, it seems to me, Paul, that if we look at the map and how things are playing out on Ukrainian territory at the moment, that there isn't a clear line. This may be relevant, for example, should Russia have taken and holding all land east of Kiev, perhaps, and then you've got western on one great big long line. But that's not the case, is it? There's conflicts that are strategically burning all over Ukraine in different strategic areas. And you can see different movements that Russia is deploying to try and achieve advantage in those areas. And as you say, in some areas it appears that despite the cities looking like an ash terrain, they have not been able to secure those areas. So it seems like the omnipositional or peacekeeping, peacemaking kind of element of it, that buffer zone doesn't seem relevant either. What else have we got?
Well, it could be. I mean, you could put interpositional peacekeepers along humanitarian corridors. For example, the exit routes out of Mariupol, which are being shelled at the moment. People fleeing.
And certainly from Kiev to the western side of Ukraine, this is something I talked about with you last week, for example, on humanitarian grounds, corridors established, maintained and sustained to be able to address this humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, and the fact is that because they're protected by blue helmets, the Russians are not supposed to attack them. Okay, and the Russians are party to UN peacekeeping conventions, so they'd be violating something they already signed up to years ago. But the point is that the peacekeepers would protect the vulnerable. See, that's where you put them in these humanitarian corridors just to prevent them from being attacked. That's responsibility to protect. You're not involving yourself in the attack. And perhaps at that point, the belligerents will realize there is no further point. No one's advancing. I'll mention the Ukrainians in a second, because it's not as if they may want peacekeepers at this moment. But let me leave that for a few minutes down the road. The third type of peacekeeping is what they call multidimensional peacekeeping. Now, whereas interpositional peacekeeping is what is properly known as peacekeeping, multidimensional is known as peacemaking. And the making is because it involves civilian reconstruction of war-damaged territory. That not only are you keeping the peace between belligerents, but you're bringing in civilian engineers, you're bringing in reconstruction efforts in order to rebuild what has been destroyed by war. Now, obviously, the belligerents would have to agree in some shape or form to this. This usually follows from the interpositional. And the issue here is that the interpositional peacekeepers are still lightly armed, but they have the right to defend themselves. So they're no longer just carrying sidearms. They will have light armored vehicles. They will have anti-tank weapons in case they're attacked. The peacemakers
but just
are
on
even
that
more.
point, but before you do go on there, I just wanted to tidy up. Do the omnipositional, if I want to put it that way, do they have the ability to protect, not just defend? So protect the vulnerable.
In a defensive way. I mean, interpositional, the idea is we will fire if we're fired upon, and we will defend the vulnerable when they're being attacked. But they don't have the heavy weaponry. See, it's by design. You would have to transgress mightily to attack the blue helmets in order to get to civilians. Now, unfortunately, in Sarajevo, Dutch peacekeepers under a positional strategy had to give way to the Serbs, who then slaughtered thousands of Kosovars, if I remember correctly. Or was it Treblinka? Anyway, one of the two places, there were Dutch peacekeepers. They were forced to retreat to their eternal shame. I mean, these people, they abdicated their responsibility to protect Muslim women and children from the depredations of the Serbs. I mean, it's a national disgrace in Holland. That cannot happen again. If the peacekeepers are going to go in the first place, they need to defend the people that they're placed in the midst of. And I think that example, that again, the act of Dutch cowardice, has been a lesson for all blue helmet types. You may remember, however, that a Fijian complement of peacekeepers were taken hostage by Syrians at the beginning of the Syrian conflict. So, it has to be very finely calibrated, and people need to know what they're getting into. Now, the peacemaking, the multi-dimensional peacekeepers, they come armed.
It's an enforcement to establish the presence type of.
Exactly. You establish a presence, and then you rebuild, you facilitate, but you just said it. You become the sovereign in that given territory, and then you rebuild it.
So what's the precedence here? Are we talking Korea in the 50s?
Korea was one of them. Haiti was another. Many people don't remember the Haitian peacekeepers. That's why I mentioned Brazil, because Brazil was very heavily involved in that. There were French peacekeepers. Haiti was involved in a vicious civil war, and they had a couple of earthquakes. Anyway, it was a disaster zone. And these peacekeepers came in to make the peace, to stop these guys from fighting and protect what was the devastated population. The record is pretty good. I mean, Haiti is a very difficult place to achieve peace, but they were able to impose their will. The will, in that instance, of the Organization of American States. That was not a UN mandate. That was an OAS mandate. Again, let's remember the audience. A regional organization can commit peacekeepers just as readily, if not more easily, than the United Nations. But let me get to the fourth type of peacekeeping, because this is where things get knotty. The fourth type is called peace enforcement. The first three are done with the consent of the belligerents. That is, the belligerents agree to whatever presence that may occur: observational, interpositional, or multidimensional. The fourth is police enforcement is done against the consent, without the consent of at least one of the belligerents. And so the idea here is one side says, yes, I'll agree to a ceasefire. The other side says, no, I'm going to press my advantage and I'm going to continue killing. That peace enforcement is full-on combat. That is the international community's troops coming in to impose, by virtue of superior military might, an outcome on the reluctant party. Okay. That was done in Belgrade, where the Serbs were on the receiving end of a peace enforcement mission, which was mostly enforced by the United States, but not exclusively the United States.
It was a bombing campaign as well, wasn't it?
Well, that would be it. The idea is, okay, the Russians don't want to stop. The Ukrainians have agreed to a ceasefire. The Russians are trying to take advantage. Then, yes, we're going to bring in fighter aircraft. We're gonna even the odds, if you will, or outnumber the Russians. That is incredibly risky.
I was going to say that, for example, no one would want to destroy any more infrastructure or kill any more people on Ukrainian soil, it seems, apart from...
But what if the
Russian
Russians?
Federation.
Yeah,
But
but what if the Russians
so
go into Western Ukraine? What if
yeah.
they cross the Dnieper River and start doing the same scorched earth campaign in Western Ukraine, heading to the cultural capital of Ukraine, Lviv?
So like you identified there, the risk factors come up. You get Putin and Lavrov and others having to question whether or not they do come true on their threats. Their deterrence rests on their ability to actually escalate should the West maneuver in a way that they determine is necessary for their own interests. So the risk factors go up. Is that something, for example, that the global community, perhaps expressed through the United Nations, would be willing to gamble on? Because it does seem like a gamble, doesn't it? There's some questions that have come in too at this juncture from the audience, and we'll get to those in just a minute, but let's address that element of the risk of escalation relating to the threats that have come out of the Russian Federation should Western nations deploy peacekeepers into the region. And secondly, let's look at the United Nations apparatus and how that may take shape from the point of view of the General Assembly floor. Paul, back to you.
Yeah, I'm trying to put myself in Russian strategic commander's shoes, not Putin's. And I'm thinking, okay, if this war starts turning unpleasantly, we've already mentioned that we may well use tactical nukes, but you can only use them inside the Ukraine, because if you attack a NATO member, then you will certainly receive a retaliatory salvo, but that's going to go at Mother Russia. That's not going to go back to the Ukraine. If you up the ante, then you get into strategic exchanges. And quite frankly, there will be no Russia after those things. So clearly, these people know that. And so they want to keep things in the theater, which you can do with tactical nukes. What I would do if I was a European member is say exactly, I can tell from your face, you're like, that ain't going to happen. I agree with you.
Not necessarily. I'm talking about escalation beyond tactical nukes, should they ever be deployed. They've never been deployed in the world before, tactical nukes. And that slippery slide is something that's formidably dangerous. Yeah.
Right. And I agree, with your concern, because the Russians may think that they can keep this limited to the Ukraine. But once you take that genie out of the bottle, tactical nukes can be very low yield and very precise. So they're like the ultimate bunker busting bomb. But they leave radioactive fields. I mean, it's not like the Armageddon scenario that is mutual assured destruction.
Yeah, man.
But that mutual assured destruction as a doctrine left the house a long time ago. Now it's all about flexible response. You up a move a little bit, we up a little over. We don't go whole hog on the deal. The Russian commanders of their nuclear forces are acutely aware of this. They're students of history. So I'm looking at this and going, they know that the chances of being able to confine this to the Ukraine, should they unleash that genie, are almost nil. I mean, once you start using nukes, especially on vulnerable populations, again, this is responsibility to protect writ large. If they're going to go after, for example, command and control centers in Kyiv with tactical nuclear weapons, they're going to kill a lot of civilians. That's unacceptable. And so I think the international community needs to emphasize, and we know that Biden is talking to NATO leaders today, is say to the Russians, look, there is a ceiling beyond which, that can of worms is opened. You've threatened us with the nukes, but just be aware that it's going to be a lot worse for you, because this war will expand. And we are prepared to weather the costs in order to keep you from going nuclear in the first instance. I tend to think that they're rational in the Kremlin, and that this has been a bluff, and it has been a successful bluff, that deterrence bluff. But now that things on the battlefield have shifted, they have to start looking at concrete solution sets And as we talked about last week and the week before, you need to give the Russians an exit strategy, some way for Putin to save face. Maybe he'll consolidate some gains in the east. I think at this point, the Ukrainians might be amenable to that. You know, that Donetsk and
Well,
Lushansk.
Zelensky said overnight in an interview, quite an extensive interview that I watched, and he made it very specific that with respect to the territories that Russia deems are its, that they are currently fighting in, he said those negotiations can take place on the merits or otherwise of those regions after a ceasefire has been observed. He's talking about ceasefire from the point of view of saving, obviously, lives and infrastructure that is being lost right now, and then those tricky issues, whether it be through mediators and third parties, is a possibility after conflict ceases. So it's very, very clear the signals that Ukraine is sending out there, saying, well, put it down to dialogue. He even talked about, for example, that if Russia believes that the people in those regions would prefer, Russian language speaking people, for example, would prefer that Russia rules or governs their areas and their regions, he actually says, well, let's put it to a referendum to those communities that live in those spaces. So there's quite a lot of talk that is going on at the moment, trying to define, well, what are the rocks in the road? Can they be navigated? Can they be postponed navigating until such a time as we're in a less hot situation? So that's an interesting part. We get back to, however, this whole situation relating to, has the tripwire relating to vulnerable, unprotected civilians, kids, babies, maternity hospitals, women who are pregnant, for God's sake, being killed or under threat, others just being destroyed indiscriminately by unsmart bombing campaigns. Has that tripwire been passed where the global community on humanitarian grounds deploys one of those definitions of peacekeeping or peacemaking to this region by way of the United Nations? Let's look at that, and then we'll get to the questions and the comments that have come in. There's one in particular I think has got good merit to look at, the hypocrisies perhaps that make people think, well, why do something like this when all of that happened over there?
Yeah, well, they can't walk back and undo what they've already done. So there's the whole issue of war crimes floating out there. And it's floating out there with regards to Russian commanders as well as the Kremlin. So that's something that's a specter on the Russian side that they need to realize could well become true if they are defeated. And that's an interesting point. If I was the Russians, I'd be negotiating with Zelensky on the terms that he's discussing, because if the tide turns militarily, and again, it's a stalemate. It went from a Russian offensive to now getting bogged down and not advancing. If the Ukrainians start launching counteroffensives and pushing them back, then obviously the terms of any negotiation are going to be different than what Zelensky's offering now. And his military commanders, let's just say, they're pretty staunch. They don't like the Russians much. So this is the moment, it's delicate and dangerous because it's fraught with opportunity costs. And by that, what I mean is maybe the Russians think that they can secure all of the southern border of the Ukraine, bordering the Azov and Black Seas. I happen to think not. But maybe they think, well, we're going to do that and then we'll quit. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, seem to think that they can start pushing them back along the north while keeping them at bay in the south. And that's crucial because the Ukrainians have thrust a wedge between Mariupol and the Crimean Peninsula. So the land bridge between the two is going to be heavily contested should the Russians try to establish it. And then again, Odessa it's going to be the gravesite of a lot of Russians if they try to take the city. So I think that, that attempt to take all of the southern flank of the Ukraine, rendering it a landlocked nation, That's a pipe dream at this point. But they got to calibrate. When will we sit down honestly to talk? And that may still be a week or two away. And then the smoke will clear. In the meantime, though, Selwyn, the Ukrainians are getting replenished. Again, I can't underestimate the logistical importance here. We always think of wars as guys with guns, but, armies are fed, armies are clothed, armies are equipped, and the Ukrainians are getting a very heavy supply line. Now, I mentioned to you in one of the last episodes, it's perfectly legitimate for the Russians to target ammunition supply lines and weapons depots in Western Ukraine. That's a legitimate military target. Not civilian humanitarian corridors, trains full of refugees. No. But the supply lines coming out of particularly Poland, but also Romania of weapons have been very effective. I'm not exactly sure how they are doing this, but they are doing it. They're flying in a lot of weapons into Lviv. And so the Russians are in the conundrum is that they're being outsupplied. And I think at that point, once you realize, this is only going to get worse for us, then you sit down and negotiate a little more seriously. And that's where the West needs to encourage the Ukrainians to give them that out, which Zelensky's doing. I mean, basically, they're going to wind up having fought a war to get what they had before, at best. I mean, maybe they'll take over Mariupol, and that'll become part of Russia. Perhaps, I'm not entirely sure. But think of it this way, Selwyn. Let's say there are several towns between Mariupol, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and the Crimea that are strategically important as milestones to establish that land bridge. Now, let's imagine that you put blue helmet peacekeepers on the roofs of hospitals, on the roofs of schools that are being used as bomb shelters. They've got the UN flag and they're on these roofs. Now, the Russians will see this, not just the fighter aircraft pilots, but their satellite operators, the targeters will look at these buildings. They'll see a bunch of peacekeepers on the top of it. The decision then is, do we take them out
I'll just raise a video on this and perhaps let it play, but there's not a lot to defend. Have a look at Mariupol at the moment. As you can see, it's what we're looking at for those that are listening and not seeing is it's pretty much an incinerated city. There's nothing functioning. There are no signs of life at all. The buildings, every one of them is destroyed and in an ash grey. The lowlands where high-rise buildings do not exist, like suburban type of shaped parts of the city, are completely wiped out as well, Paul. So this is where we've got to, and this is why the humanitarian crisis has advanced so high and so strongly, and the arguments of responsibility to protect and defence in that regard, humanitarian defence, are getting elevated in this last 7 days because of exactly what we've just seen at Mariupol. Now, I'll just go to a couple of questions that have come in. If this was going to, and it does seem it's going to be taken to the General Assembly. The General Assembly, as we speak, has been meeting on emergency measures relating to Ukraine. Something is going to come from this. There's others that are saying from the community, like a person I respect very much here, Donna Marie Lawson, who's put a question to us, and it's very simple. It's 3 words. Donna Marie says, like in Palestine. I know exactly what Donna is talking about there. That there's been issues relating to humanitarian crisis and tragedy in places like the Gaza Strip, the West Bank. We've seen it all over the world where at the United Nations, we're talking Security Council here as opposed to the General Assembly, and you've made the distinction between the two. But we've seen forces of the West, like the United States, veto any move to try and actually address the issues relating to one-sided aggression from the point of view of disproportionate is what I'm talking about here. So there is a voice out there with people who are saying, why should the global community on responsibility to protect principles get itself involved in Ukraine when it doesn't do anything that may harm or create an instability of the balance that the West enjoys with some of its allies? That hypocrisy is another whole program, but it exists, and it is an inertia perhaps in the war of public opinion that exists very strongly, perhaps from those that pacifist intent, perhaps those that subscribe to perhaps left peacekeeping and peace groups. That view in various forms is very strong. Why this? Some even defend Russia's right to be doing what it's doing and exclude the arguments of, well, hang on a minute, we've got children dying here. And they say, yeah, but it happened over in Palestine. Why now? I'm putting it out there, not from the point of view of me subscribing to such ideas that are being put about, but those exist. Even in countries like New Zealand, it's very strong.
I have no time for this type of whataboutism. Hypocrisy is a mainstay of the human character. And just because we haven't acted to address atrocities in the past doesn't mean that we shouldn't act now. I subscribe to the belief that the Israelis have committed crimes against humanity in Palestine. But the powers that be in Europe and what have you have given them carte blanche to do so. It's wrong. It's unacceptable. Perhaps if we address stuff in the Ukraine, we can then retroactively apply the responsibility to protect doctrine to Israel-Palestine and bring the Israeli war criminals to justice in the International Criminal Court, something which I know has been attempted. But we must stop this bit about, well, why should we worry about the Ukraine because these other guys did this and, oh, imperialists and what have you. My mind is imperialism is bad, period, no matter who does it. And it wasn't just Europeans who did it. What the Israelis do in Palestine, what the Saudis are doing in Yemen is atrocious. But the world doesn't seem to care as much for Palestinians and Yemenis, or Houthis in particular. That's on them. We have a moment now to address war crimes and address the fate of vulnerable populations in the Ukraine. I say no matter what we didn't do in the past, let's step up to the plate now. And then, bolstered by the fact that maybe we do get the Russians to back off, then we can turn around retrospectively and apply that critical, focus on places like Israel. But it does us no good if we're going to stand around and start doing moral equivalence, juggling balls of moral equivalence between Israeli, Palestine, Yemen, and every other bad thing that has happened to innocents, over centuries, then we'll never stop this. I mean, that's the point. Rwanda was supposed to be a moment of reckoning for the international community where they stood by and watched a genocide happen. They knew it was happening and they watched it. The Canadians, to their credit, came up and said, we can't allow this. We're going to, create this convention known as R2P, responsibility to protect. We need to enforce it. So I would say we try to get involved in the Ukrainian situation, conflict, under R2P principles for the Ukrainians' sake. Not for any other, not because of history, not because these are vulnerable populations. And we don't need to leave the past in the past. We can turn and revisit what the Israelis have done to Palestinians over decades. It doesn't mean, I always think of, the Jewish Nazi hunters. I was living in Argentina when Eichmann was captured by the Mossad. He lived, as it turns
early
out,
1960s, quite a long time after the fall of...
right. He lived six blocks from my house.
Wow.
My father was a World War II veteran. He was dancing when it was revealed that the Israelis had come down so close to us and got rid of this war criminal. I say we should have long memories, uh, very long memories, when it comes to the Palestinian Israeli conflict. But right now, clearly in front of us, war crimes are being committed, and we have a duty to protect. It's just that we have to do so with some nuance and finesse, which is why I say we shouldn't have NATO peacekeepers, because the Russians will not allow that. But if others of us come to the fray and put ourselves between the aggressors and the victims, then perhaps we're going to develop a skill set or a tool set for mitigating future conflicts when innocent populations are at risk.
And of course, coming out of that, it may be, for example, that countries like Canada have to stand back because of their NATO membership. They may instigate a dialogue from the top table, if you like, at the United Nations General Assembly. And I'll just bring up, because I'm making a point here that dovetails in with David Mooring's comment. David wrote in and he says here through our program, Russia inherited a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council from it being part of the USSR. Could the UN remove Russia's permanent seat? So what we're talking about here is a response that, because of that fact and the veto elements of a permanent member like Russia stopping the Security Council from doing anything at the United Nations, so therefore Paul has looked at the General Assembly from the point of view of making a move. And he underscored, for example, that Canada seems to be positioning in a way of getting a dialogue going. If Canada does, there is a very powerful group within the United Nations General Assembly that includes Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and then dovetails out to social democratic countries from that when it is convenient to do so. It may be, for example, that Canada pulls back from the point of view of initiating an operation relating to this, and it may be on the basis of talks between the two countries, perhaps, and that Australia, with its regional power status that it is assumed, and others like Japan, for example, start to take a very, very active role inside Ukraine should the opportunity develop. But, Paul, let's get back to the realities here of the European nations being very, very, very cautious. And I'm talking some of the NATO countries, for example, are not there relating to where Poland is, for example. So we take that out. Do you think the European Union nations, the members of the European Unions, whether or not they be from an economy point of view or statehood point of view, do you think that they would support at the United Nations such a move should it develop in earnest?
A short answer is yes, if it's presented the right way. I should note, just apropos your previous remarks, I'm on record as saying that I think the Security Council should be held on a rotating basis. There should be no permanent members. That's an archaic system. I actually think that removing the United States from the Security Council might be a beneficial thing. We tend to focus on the Russians and the Chinese as being obstructionists, and
Because
clearly they are.
Palestinian interests came up before, and it's the United States that vetoes
Yeah.
any move relating to responsibility to protect when things get
Absolutely.
pretty bad and dire in that region.
Yeah. So I think that the General Assembly would have to vote for a change in the charter so that there are no permanent members, and then you get a rotational basis. I happen to think that's what should be done, because as it is, the Security Council is stalemated. But the General Assembly can still get things done. And now that getting to the point of the European Union, if you present it as we need your support to get peacekeepers into the Ukraine, we understand the Russians' extreme hostility towards NATO peacekeepers. So we are trying to get peacekeepers from other countries. Let's say India. Again, I mentioned some countries before, countries that have practiced peacekeeping, on the ground in various conflict zones. Get them involved and have the logistic support of the European community or whatever regional organization may want to get involved, if not the UN itself. The Russians may not be happy that peacekeepers are being introduced, but again, it's not an escalation. It is a very clear attempt at de-escalation. And so for them to prosecute the conflict in the face of peacekeepers being introduced, particularly if harm comes to lightly armed peacekeepers who are just trying to keep everybody at arm's length, then I think the Russians will bear the full brunt of a much larger campaign that will extend well beyond NATO, because at that point, you're violating international norms in such an egregious fashion in the face of near unanimous support in the international community for a ceasefire, that you'll have no excuse for doing so. And if your recourse is escalation, well, the consequences of that are quite obvious to behold. So it seems to me we may have another couple of weeks to run on this, but the key to me will be if the Ukrainians visibly turn the tide. They've already recaptured a few towns. I talked about the encircling of a whole army corps northwest of Kiev. If they start pushing the Russians back, man, if I was a Russian, if I was Lavrov, I'd be, getting Zelensky on the phone and saying, that the terms that you were talking about, we keeping the autonomous regions, maybe a referendum down the road. Let's talk about that. They want also recognition that Crimea is Russian. That's going to be a lot stickier for the Ukrainians. That's a tough pill to swallow. But all of that's got to go on the table. And then the backdrop again involves issues of war crimes, involves, for quite frankly, for Putin, anything short of total victory, I would reckon, could spell the end of him. I'll say it again. I think he's a dead man walking. I think no matter how this comes out, because it's not going to come out entirely in Russian favor, he's thrown his chips on the table, and he hasn't won big. I would imagine that there will be consequences back at home once this is all resolved. So, let's take baby steps first. The war is going to continue for the foreseeable future, but it's going to be slow. It's a war of attrition at this point. Again, there are counteroffensives. If we can get, I would say that what we got to get are interpositional blue helmets on the ground along the front lines wherever they may be. Now, that's the trouble there, is getting enough boots on the ground. I mean, how many Fijian peacekeepers, can Fiji afford to lend? How many Indian peacekeepers? You're going to need.
And India is not going to come in on this because of its dependency on Russian arms. Total maximum dependency. Modi has got different ideas than perhaps his predecessors had. There's political issues that are challenging on that point relating to Indian peacekeepers.
Yeah, no, I agree. Although, I think of India and China a lot here because they're both sort of sitting on the fence. The Chinese originally were leaning heavily in the Russians' favor, but President Xi has sort of leaned back now a little bit because he's starting to see this, this thing can mushroom in unexpected ways. We haven't even seen.
He said a lot of things last week in his telephone bilateral with Joe Biden, the President of the United States. Well, one of the things he did say was this war's got to stop. I'm talking Xi here. So, he did say a lot of things, but there was that as well. And that's the kind of thing that you latch onto, don't you? When you're talking big stakes diplomacy where it is essential that talking with respect to advantage and common ground be the dialogue that's embarked on, surely.
Yeah, I mean, let's think of it from just a basic human nature standpoint. And again, I still puzzle over what Putin's end game is. I'm like, what does he expect to get out of this? Because it ain't going well. Now, if we take it from a human nature standpoint, what human beings want in economics, business, diplomacy, in their own personal lives is certainty. We want the certainty so that our trade relations can be maintained, people play by the rules, that sort of thing. What do we fear the most? Uncertainty. An uncertain future where norms are not norms, rules are violated. That's the moment we're living in right now. The uncertainty stemming from the Ukrainian war are myriad and multiple. And so everybody in a vested interest in a peaceful world has to say, we got to put an end to this war. This is not achieving anything except make everybody anxious and nervous. Again, we have the specter of nukes. We have the specter of chemical weapons. I mean, this is not a good situation. And it was instigated by the Russians. And so, just as the Russians have, leveled all sorts of historical grievances, on the table, have talked about Nazis and what have you. The point is, whatever those justifications were and are, the situation now is that they haven't achieved their goals. There is a stalemate. Innocent people are dying. The international community is, all a tizzy because every single rule of non-aggression has been broken. And so I would imagine that the big countries, maybe not the Chinese because of their special relationship with the Russians, but maybe even Modi and the Indians will say, look, we're honest brokers. See, I think that's the key, is the Russians need to trust the blue helmets as much as the Ukrainians do. That's why NATO cannot happen. But
otherwise,
maybe
you've got
Indians,
enforcement operations that occur.
well, then you could put blue. Yeah, but Selwyn, you can put blue helmets on a NATO soldier. He's still a NATO soldier, and he's going to be looking at Russians. That's a no-go. So, but if you bring in people who have no axe to grind with Russia, who have been,
in that regard,
I think
I
that's
really strongly subscribe to your point there that it can, any kind of peacekeeping force or maneuver or operation cannot include NATO countries. Even the Canadians need to be out of that, and they're probably regarded as one of the more pacifistic. Should we wrap it up, Paul? What's your final word on this, and then I'll wrap it up and just address a couple of questions here that have come in.
And I appreciate that people are, in fact, asking questions. No, my short conclusion is watch this space. But I think that you and I have been pretty good over the past few weeks at sort of seeing the evolution of this conflict for what it really is. I try to separate all the propaganda that I see because obviously the two of us spend a lot of time reading and watching news. And I think, this is going to have a while to run yet. But in the next couple of weeks, I think we're going to see the manifestations of a potential agreement. And that agreement, whatever it may be, will be brokered on the back of the introduction of peacekeepers sometime in the near future to at least, get a start on pulling these belligerents apart and creating space by doing so for serious negotiations to happen. I think Zelensky's very much aware of this. The question now is, when will the Russian leadership realize that there will be no military gains beyond what they've achieved today, but there will be reputational losses of a major way with perhaps personal consequences to the Russian leadership if they persist in this venture now that it's clear that they cannot win easily or at all.
Okay, thank you for that, Paul, and appreciate your input. And you may actually want to respond to a couple of things here, but that'll be your prerogative. For first instance, David Mooring, he says, so the war will end either with the replacement of Putin or another oligarch, or offering Putin an out with a treaty that is advantageous to Russian interests in Europe, otherwise just a ceasefire. We've also got a position that has come in here, which could be a whole episode really on this one, but it's a great position from Kemp Sanders. And Kemp says, how effective is the West's new approach to Putin's information war, i.e. front-running with media releases covering about every conceivable hostile act? So Paul, your prerogative there if you want to address either of those two.
Yeah, well, with regards to the second question, I think that it's an interesting, psychological warfare, and the propaganda wars they run in parallel to the kinetic battlefield, but they've been quite fascinating. And the Ukrainians, are giving as well as they're getting. I mean, I think that they have proven to be very practiced at the art of deception, the art of deflection. We always thought the Russians were always ahead when it came to psychological operations, and they are still very good at it. But they're meeting, if not their match, they're getting their comeuppance, because it's not just the Ukrainians who are now spilling out disinformation. I mean, a lot of what we're getting from the West in terms of Russian losses and that sort of thing may be highly inflated and distorted, but it's having an impact on global popular perceptions. Now, with regards to the first question, which, and again, I appreciate both of them. One thing we have to make clear here, Selwyn, and I think this is paramount: the West is not interested in regime change in Moscow.
Yep.
Right? We need to understand, we want the Russians out of Ukraine. What happens to Putin and his regime, that's up to the Russians. We should avoid at all costs talking about removing Putin. Didn't Lindsey Graham, that senator, a Republican senator, say he wanted Putin assassinated? I would say, buddy, keep it to yourself. Okay, keep it to yourself.
Look, 2 weeks ago, Kennedy Graham was pushing for United States inclusion in the International Criminal Court. I thought, oh, there's merit to that discussion. Let's have that discussion. Seems to have gone off the radar. There's a lot of emphasis relating to recourse and justice via the International Criminal Court, and a lot of those voices calling for that are coming from the United States. We'll put the money where the mouth is and join the International Criminal Court. You once did under Bill Clinton. You pulled out under George W. Bush. It's time to reconnect to the global body that could address such things, I would say. But this kind of talk from Kennedy Graham on that is just, it seems to me to be posturing.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, hey, I just thought of a parallel that may be worth considering. Let's compare and contrast, for the purposes of this argument, the two invasions, the two Gulf Wars. In the first Gulf War, the United States fronted a coalition that pushed Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait. They stopped at the border. In other words, that whole war was to get Saddam out of Kuwait. They defended the sovereign state of Kuwait. They stopped at the Iraqi border, and they did not engage in regime change. I mean, maybe they were spooking around.
Not until
that's
later.
my point.
Yeah.
But that's my point. That first thing, okay, that first Gulf War met with international approval. You know, kick the aggressor out, make him go home, and then go about your business. The second Gulf War, which was built on a mountain of lies, caused the invasion, did not receive anywhere near the support for the first one. Why? Because it was basically a ruse to engage in regime change. And that's my point. If the international community uses R2P and peacekeeping to get the Russians to withdraw to Russia, we should end it there. No talk about removing Putin, no talk about regime change. Again, that's the sovereign destiny of the Russians. It's for them to decide. But if we start conflating ending the war with, blaming the Russians or blaming Putin to the point that it gets personalized, or to the point that, as in Libya, it goes from responsibility to protect to removing Gaddafi. This goes from responsibility to protect to removing Putin. I see no end. I see no end to it.
No,
and I see no good coming from it.
And it also plays into the fears that a lot from the left positions are arguing that that's exactly the purpose and the stealth-like mandate that some of the Western countries want to actually push for. So Kennedy Graham is basically underscoring those fears. Paul, I'll conclude. And as we've heard today, there is a way for the wider global community to assist in defending Ukraine's vulnerable people. And from the point of view of subjectivity, such big issues become personal. Personally, I'm not one who subscribes to the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. However, it's clear that the threat of escalation and the will to escalate is the most powerful deterrence, and Putin at this juncture does seem to have that air of the West and is an advantage for his in this regard. But does deterrence work, or does it only work when opposing forces are led by reasoned and reasonable people? Therefore, does deterrence work against a leader like Putin, who has crossed his Rubicon and has perhaps gone too far to accept a defeat, retreat, or even a stalemate? I guess these are the questions that are going to endure as the months go ahead from here, unless something is done, and perhaps the responsibility to protect principles deserve all of the debate and action that this occurrence demands. So thank you for your attention to those points, Paul. I really appreciate your dialogue and your guidance through these difficult and complex geopolitical times, for notwithstanding defence and issues relating to humanitarianism. And those who have been through the journey with us for this episode live, we appreciate that in the comments that have come through. And also we look forward to your attention to the program this week, around about midday Thursday New Zealand time, which will be Wednesday evening United States Eastern time. Until then, take care.